Hi everybody, welcome to my video. In this video I'm going to be introducing the topic of opening statements in the intercollegiate negotiation and arbitration competition and how you can make a good one. I'm going to go over 4 topics that will teach you how to make a good one. First I'm going to go over what is an opening statement, really basic question, and why it's an important thing. After that, I'm going to go over what you should include in your opening statement, what the content of it should be. Then I'm going to go over how you should structure it, what order you should present that information in, basically. And then finally, I'm going to go over some style points in how you actually orally present it. So let's begin with the first question, which is what is an opening statement? So an opening statement in the arbitration round is basically a statement. It's your first opportunity to tell the arbitrators what your case is about, what conclusions you want them to reach are, and how you will convince them of the strength of your case later on in the arbitration when you actually make your substantive arguments. Now, in the competition, if you look at the rules, and here I'm basing this on the 2019 rules, which are the most recent ones I have available. These might change from year to year, so be aware of that. But in the most recent set of rules, it says that you have to provide a 3-minute opening statement for each case in the arbitration round. Now, this also varies a bit from year to year. Sometimes there's 2, 3, even in some years there's been as many as 4 cases. So I think last year there was only 2. But anyway, for each of those individual cases, you'll have to make an opening statement of 3 minutes in which you kind of introduce everything. So the opening statement is really important because it's a very good chance to make a positive impression. It allows you to kind of put in the brains of the arbitrators exactly what they can expect. You've told them what conclusion you want them to draw, and they kind of understand at the end of hearing your opening statement, they'll understand what the issues are, and now they can kind of sit back. Well, they won't really, well, maybe they will sit back, I don't know. But they'll be able to sort of say, okay, now I know what I can expect, and they'll await convincing by you and also the other team who has also made an opening statement. Another point about the opening statement that is worth mentioning is that it's one of the few times in the competition, at least the arbitration round, where you'll be able to present a speech more or less verbatim. Because the arbitrators, they won't interrupt you, they won't ask you questions during it. So this is one thing that you can really prepare in advance, like an actual speech. It's like a speech that you will give to them. So that's another thing that kind of sets it apart from other elements of the arbitration. So that's basically what it is. Now, what should you put in your opening statement? You have 3 minutes. You got to convince them. What do you need to tell them? So I think the best advice is your opening statement should be a kind of map that you're giving to the arbitrators of your side's case. So you can imagine that the arbitrators, you can kind of assume actually that the arbitrators are unfamiliar with the details of the case. And they are very eager to hear from you everything they need to know to understand what the case is about and what the arguments are. In reality, of course, the arbitrators will have read your memorandum and the opposing side's memorandum, but you can kind of assume that they're blank slates awaiting your input to fill their brains. Because it's safe to do that because some of them, I mean, they will have read them, but they might have read them a couple of days ago. They might have forgotten or something. So to be on the safe side, don't assume that they have a great deal of detailed knowledge about what the case is about. And so with that in mind, how do you draw a map? Well, each case has like several issues, right? Some of them might have 2 or 3. which will require you to make some sort of arguments. So in the opening statement, you'll basically want to give a really, really brief summary of what those are. So you'll tell the arbitrators what the case is about, what the conclusions are that you'll want them to reach, and how you're going to convince them of that, of the validity of that conclusion using the application of the rules to the facts that are in the problem. And so because you have very limited time, 3 minutes, you have to be very careful to only include the most relevant arguments and facts that are necessary. You're providing them with a kind of like a framework of the overall argument. And you do not need to go into much detail here in the opening statement about the evidence and rules. You will go into detail about that later on. When you're preparing it, you're going to have to, because of that 3-minute time limit, you're going to have to make some kind of difficult editorial decisions about what to include and what not to include. And generally, you should try to economize as much as possible on stuff to put in it, simply because of that 3-minute time limit. But at the same time, though, you don't want to leave like key elements out. You want to just provide them with enough of your argument that it kind of makes logical sense. So that's basically what you should put in a kind of abstract way. You also have to consider how you're going to structure that. So you have all this information that you have to put in. You have to organize it in some way that's going to be easy for the arbitrators to understand, like this what might be actually like a complex case. The way I would recommend doing it is to start, simply, of course, introduce yourself. Because there are more than one opening statement that you'll have to give. If you're the first person doing it, you can introduce yourself and the members of your team. But do this very, very quickly. This shouldn't take more than a few seconds. I'm Sean. I'm for Blue. Hi. Kind of, well, like that. Then you'll probably want to summarize the facts of the case very, very quickly, just to give them, like, again, if you're assuming that they don't have a great deal of background knowledge on the case, or maybe they need to have their memories refreshed, and they probably will need to have their memories refreshed. Tell them, these cases are almost always about a contract. Tell them what that contract is, the nature of it, and what the dispute is about. This should take a couple of sentences. Now, each team will give an opening statement, and how much of that background information you give might depend on whether or not you're the first or the second team to give their opening statement, because you don't need to repeat that background information if the other team has already given it. You might be able to frame your little introductory bit as a kind of response to whatever red has just said or blue has just said, as the case may be. This too, though, should only be like a couple of sentences. It should not take up too much time. After that, you'll want to tell, you want to tell the judges what is the overall conclusion that you want them to reach. For example, blue is not liable for a breach of the contract, or something like that, like the overall conclusion that you're aiming for. Then you'll want to tell them, okay, in order to establish that, there are several things that we will need to argue, several issues. And you'll want to provide them with like an actual list of those. Maybe there might be 2 or 3 things that you'll need to argue, issues that you need to argue in order to establish that. So it's good to actually like provide a numbered list. These are called signposts. It's something that's quite useful to use. So if you say, okay, in order to establish that conclusion, first we'll need to talk about issue X, then we will need to talk about issue Y, and finally we will need to talk about issue Z. So once you provide that list in order, like 1, 2, 3, first, second, third, the arbitrators are able to immediately understand subconsciously in their brains, okay, I know there are 3 issues, and now when you go into detail, I will understand where you are in your argument, like what order this will be presented to us in. And then you'll want to like really quickly go over each of those issues. So this is issue 1. This is what our position is on that. This is how we are going to convince you of that based on rules and evidence. Then this is issue 2, and you repeat for however many issues that you have. Then you wrap it all up with an overall conclusion. And for those reasons, we argue that blue is not liable for a breach, or whatever the problem requires you to argue. And so that's how the general structure, I mean, it should look, or at least that's a good model, I think, for structuring it. Some people might structure it slightly differently, but I think this is it's very easy to follow if you present it that way. So I'd also like to say something a bit about the style with which you present all of that. So there are some like obvious points, and these are kind of actually general points that don't just apply to the opening statement, but apply to basically everything you say in the entire arbitration round. First, maintain eye contact with the judges. There will be 3 of them, and so look to them as you're speaking. With the opening statement, as I mentioned earlier, you can prepare a speech that you will deliver verbatim, but you should not be reading this off a piece of paper. You should remember it. It is perfectly acceptable, and it's actually like a very good idea to have like some notes or like something on your computer or whatever that you will look to kind of remind you where you are in your speech. As kind of just like a refresher, and you can look down to that momentarily every once in a while, but just don't be reading from it, because if you're making eye contact with the judges, I mean, it forces them to look at you. They might be tempted to well, probably in the opening statement there won't be too much, but especially when you're making arguments, people might drift off or something. But if you're looking at them, they can't do that just because of the way humans are kind of conditioned to react to being looked at. So take advantage of that, and it also kind of projects confidence on your part. So it's a good way of creating a positive impression. Second issue is the speed at which you talk. Be very aware of that. You will likely be very like your initial inclination will be to speak fast, because you have a 3-minute speech, which is likely to be very strictly observed, although it kind of depends on the arbitrators. They might give you a little leeway, but you can definitely not count on that. So you might feel tempted to speak fast so that you can get through it in that 3-minute time period. But I would recommend strongly against doing that. If you speak too fast, I mean, it's very difficult for people to follow what you're saying. So speak in a kind of deliberate, at a very deliberate speed, giving enough time for people to follow you. And as I mentioned earlier, that'll be difficult because you have a lot of things to put into the speech. And the best way of dealing with that is to put less in it. Try to economize on words as much as possible. And don't put any unnecessary detail into your opening statement. So you have to, so preparation is important in that respect as well. So I mean, the tone, or not the tone, the speed at which I'm speaking now, I think it's like reasonably easy to follow, and maybe this is a good rough guide to how fast you should speak when you're giving your opening statement and also your arguments later on in the competition. Another thing to note is the tone. Be aware of the tone that you are speaking with. If you are speaking monotonously, it will be very boring, and the arbitrators might not be able to follow what you're saying. So in contrast, if you vary your tone and start speaking in a way where you raise your pitch a bit when you're emphasizing something, and it goes up and down, it's another thing that kind of makes it easier for other human beings to pay attention to you, because I don't know, something is triggered in our brains that does that, and makes your speech a little bit more interesting, regardless of the content. So be aware of the tone as well. And another thing you might want to be aware of is your body language. Everybody subconsciously has some sort of, well, look what I'm doing with my hands right now. So as I speak, I always move my hands around a lot when I'm speaking in public or when I'm giving a lecture or something. And I oftentimes don't even notice it. I'm noticing it now because I'm looking at myself on a screen as I'm being recorded. So everybody has something like that, some sort of body language tick or whatever that they do when they're speaking. And usually those are fine. But when you're giving an opening statement or making arguments, I don't know, you want to be avoiding doing stuff that might be distracting to the arbitrators. I mean, I think my moving my hands is actually not too much of a problem, especially if they logically follow what's coming out of my mouth. Like if I say, oh, I have a list of 3 things, 1, 2, 3. So okay, look at my fingers. I'm incorporating my gesticulation with what I'm saying. That's a positive thing. But you know, if I'm kind of like sitting like, you know, judge, if I'm being too casual or something, conveying like too much casualness in my body language, that might be like not positively perceived. So it's another thing to be aware of. In terms of body language too, you can also be careful to pay attention to the body language of the people you are speaking to, the arbitrators. Not so much in the opening statement because it's only 3 minutes, but especially when you're making your arguments later on. Do they look bored? Do they look confused? Do they look like they want to ask you a question because they're not following? Be attuned to what your audience is, how your audience is reacting to what you're saying. Okay, so combined, all of these things that I've just talked about, hopefully can allow, if you incorporate all of those things into your opening statement, you should be able to make like a fairly good one. So remember, content-wise, you want to hit the main points that are going to be presented in your argument. The conclusions, you want them to draw, how you're going to lead them to those conclusions using the rules and evidence that are available, and then draw a final conclusion after that. So to illustrate like how you can put these into an actual opening statement, in the next video I'm going to give an example of me delivering an opening statement, and so please take a look at that and pay close attention to how I try to incorporate everything that I've told you in this video into what I say and how I say it in that video. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next video. Or no, I won't, but you'll see me. So bye.